Captain Marlowe's hands clenched the wheel, knuckles white against the leather as he steered through the deserted streets. The headlights cut swathes through the creeping fog, casting an eerie glow on the empty storefronts and scattered debris. His mind was racing, piecing together the fragmented reports that had trickled in through dispatch, each more horrifying than the last. Whatever was happening here was no simple riot. Beside him, in the cruiser, Deputy Haynes reloaded his pistol, his face pale, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. In the back seat, Officer Ruiz gripped a makeshift crowbar she'd snatched from a nearby garage before they'd left, her usual calm replaced by a hard-edged focus. Marlowe was all too aware of the tension settling over his team like a heavy blanket. He took a quick glance in the rearview mirror, eyes darkening as he thought of the young officer they'd left behind. Rookie Officer Ethan Marks had been tasked with guarding the station. Marlowe hadn't been given much choice. They had received an urgent call to respond to a crisis in the heart of town, but no backup was available. Ethan was left alone with limited information, unaware of the true scope of what they were up against. "Captain," Ruiz's voice broke the silence, low but edged with apprehension. "How bad do you think it is?" Marlowe's jaw tightened as he surveyed the road ahead. "Bad enough," he said, the resentment in his voice clear. Most of the department's reserves had been taken by another unit on a call across the county, leaving them armed with a few half-empty magazines and a single shotgun with 3 shells. They turned down a narrow street, and Marlowe slowed the cruiser as something shifted in his peripheral vision. Shadows lurked on the edges of the headlights, wavering figures that seemed to melt into the fog, only to reappear closer each time he looked. Just civilians, he thought, until his gaze settled on the twisted forms emerging from the mist. He recognized the face of old Mr. Benson, the town's retired postman, shuffling forward with vacant eyes, a bloody gash down his cheek that exposed bone. His arms hung limp at his sides, his mouth opening and closing in unnatural movements, as though trying to form words he no longer remembered. "Captain." Haynes's voice was barely a whisper, as more figures stumbled out of the fog, their steps uneven, some dragging broken limbs or trailing intestines across the ground like macabre party streamers. Marlowe's blood ran cold as he recognized the unmistakable emptiness in their eyes. These weren't injured civilians. They were something else entirely. He'd seen enough horror in his years on the force to know death, and death was all that remained in those faces. "Everyone out. Now," Marlowe ordered, his voice a harsh rasp as he threw the cruiser into park and grabbed the shotgun from the dash. They stepped out onto the pavement, each one of them instinctively backing up until they formed a triangle, the cruiser's headlights casting long shadows across the street. Marlowe counted at least a dozen of them, shambling toward them in a slow but determined march, some stumbling over one another in grotesque waves. Is this some kind of disease?" Haynes stammered, his voice tight with panic as he raised his pistol. "Keep it together, Deputy." Marlowe leveled the shotgun, his heart pounding. "Aim for the head, and don't waste a shot." The first of the undead lurched forward with a guttural groan, its hands outstretched, fingers shredded and bloody. Marlowe pulled the trigger, and the blast echoed through the street as the creature's head exploded in a spray of dark, oily blood. The body crumpled, but 2 more took its place, indifferent to the carnage. Haynes fired next, his hands shaking as he squeezed off 3 shots, 2 going wide, the third lodging in the shoulder of a decayed woman in a torn floral dress. She staggered, then lurched forward again, unfazed, her mouth slack and dark with blood. "Damn it, Haynes," Marlowe barked, racking the shotgun. "Make every shot count." Ruiz was already moving, her crowbar swinging in wide arcs as she stepped forward, caving in the skull of one of the zombies with a sickening crunch. Blood splattered across her arms and face, but she didn't flinch, her gaze steely as she swung again, cleaving through the jaw of another that had managed to close the distance. But for everyone they took down, more seemed to emerge from the darkness, a ceaseless wave of bodies that closed in on them, step by dragging step. "Captain, we're getting boxed in." Haynes' voice was rising, panic breaking through as he emptied his last clip, only to see his bullets barely slow the advancing horde. Marlowe cursed under his breath, knowing their chances were dwindling with each passing second. The shotgun was down to 1 shell, and his sidearm only held 6 rounds. Desperation clawed at his thoughts as he scanned their surroundings, searching for any way out. There, he pointed to a narrow alleyway just ahead, barely wide enough to fit them, but a temporary escape route nonetheless. "Fall back. Move." They dashed down the alley, Marlowe in the lead, Ruiz close behind, and Haynes bringing up the rear. The undead shuffled after them, their relentless groans echoing off the brick walls, filling the tight space with a cacophony of dread. They emerged from the alley into an open lot, a hardware store looming across the street, its windows dark and empty. Without a word, Marlowe motioned for them to follow, and they barreled through the glass doors, quickly dragging shelves and tables to barricade the entrance. Inside, the silence was deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing and the faint scrape of fingernails against the windows as the undead gathered outside, their vacant eyes fixed on the dim glow inside. Marlowe took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a plan. They were low on ammunition, their weapons were practically useless against the sheer number of infected, and they had no backup coming. He thought of Ethan, alone at the station, probably hearing snippets of chaos over the radio without knowing what was really happening. "Kid, you have no idea how lucky you are to be behind locked doors right now," he thought grimly. Ruiz broke the silence, her voice low. "Captain, what the hell are we dealing with?" Marlowe shook his head, the words heavy on his tongue. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's spreading. Fast." He glanced at the radio on his belt, wondering if any of his officers were left to respond. The thought hung between them, dark and unspoken, that they were on their own, surrounded, and the town they'd once protected was now their greatest enemy. As they fortified their barricades, the groaning outside grew louder, more insistent, the bodies piling up against the glass. The air inside grew thick with fear, a palpable reminder that they were trapped, and every second brought them closer to the inevitable. With a final glance at his officers, Marlowe gripped his shotgun, feeling the weight of its single shell. "We're not getting out of here by waiting. We need to keep moving." Haynes met his gaze, his face pale but resolute. "Then let's make every damn shot count." The captain nodded, steeling himself. Outside, the horde waited, silent and hungry, the night thick with the promise of death. The flickering emergency lights cast eerie, wavering shadows across the walls of the hardware store as Captain Marlowe, Deputy Haynes, and Officer Ruiz stood in the center aisle, their backs to each other. The sound of groaning and relentless pounding on the glass front of the store filled the air, an unceasing reminder of the nightmare waiting just outside. "Anything we can use?" Marlowe asked, his voice low but edged with urgency. "Nothing worth much," Ruiz replied, holding up a hammer and a rusted old hatchet. She hefted the hatchet, testing its weight with a grimace. Not exactly ideal. Haynes held up a shovel and an old hunting knife, his face pale, his hands trembling. "We're screwed, aren't we?" Marlowe shot him a hard look. "Get your head on straight, deputy. Panicking isn't going to get us out of here alive." He paused, listening to the unrelenting scrape of fingernails against glass, the faint guttural moans that filtered through the walls. "We need to keep moving. If we stay here, they'll break through eventually, and we'll be sitting ducks." As if in response, the glass shattered. A bloodied arm reached through, groping blindly, its flesh raw and torn. Another body slammed against the window, followed by another and another, each one adding weight, each one forcing their way through the growing fractures. Marlowe's heart hammered as he shouldered the shotgun, aiming it at the window. "When they get through, stay low and head for the alley," he ordered, voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. With a deafening crash, the glass gave way, and the horde spilled into the store, a wave of rotting flesh and empty, hungry eyes. Marlowe fired, the shotgun's blast tearing through the first wave of bodies, sending bits of flesh and bone flying. The force staggered the front ranks, but the rest surged forward, undeterred. "Go!" Marlowe barked, swinging the shotgun like a club as they broke for the alley. Ruiz led the way, swinging the hatchet to clear a path, the blade sinking into skulls and necks with sickening crunches. Haynes followed, wielding the shovel, his face twisted in horror as he brought it down on anything that moved. The smell was overwhelming, blood, rot, and decay, mingling in the confined space. Marlowe could feel it coating his skin, seeping into his pores as they fought their way through, the undead pressing in on all sides, relentless in their pursuit. They burst into the alley, stumbling over bodies, their clothes smeared with blood and viscera. Marlowe's stomach churned, but he forced himself to keep moving, his focus on survival, on putting as much distance between them and the horde as possible. They rounded a corner, only to come face to face with another group of infected. These ones were fresher, their wounds still raw, their bodies less decomposed. Some were children, their small frames twisted and unnatural, faces blank and slack. A young boy with a broken leg hobbled forward, mouth open in a silent scream, his teeth bared, blood-stained fingers reaching out. Ruiz hesitated, her grip on the hatchet faltering. "Oh, God. They're just kids." "They're not kids anymore," Marlowe said, voice cold. He grabbed her arm, forcing her to keep moving as the undead closed in around them. He could feel the hot breath of one of them on his neck, could hear the snap of its teeth as it lunged, and he barely ducked in time, swinging the shotgun butt into its skull, the bone cracking under the impact. Haynes screamed as a zombie grabbed his arm, its teeth sinking into his wrist. He swung the shovel wildly, breaking free, but the damage was done. Blood streamed down his hand, dark and glistening, as he staggered back, panic flashing in his eyes. "I'm bitten," he yelled, voice cracking with terror. Marlowe's gaze hardened and he looked Haynes square in the eye. "Then make your last minutes count." Haynes nodded, swallowing hard, a flicker of determination settling over his face as he gripped the shovel, bracing himself for the swarm that was descending upon them. They backed into a narrow, dead-end street, their backs against a graffiti-stained wall, the undead closing in on all sides. Ruiz swung her hatchet with wild abandon, the blade biting into flesh and bone, spraying blood across the walls, while Marlowe used the last shell in the shotgun, blasting through a line of bodies and buying them a few precious seconds. Haynes fought with desperation, swinging the shovel with everything he had, every blow taking down one of the infected, but leaving him more exhausted, more blood-soaked. His bitten arm hung limp at his side, the blood loss taking its toll, his movements growing sluggish. "Captain, we're not getting out of here." Ruiz's voice was barely audible over the din of the horde, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with the realization of their fate. Marlowe looked around, searching for any way out, any escape route. But all he saw were blank, hungry eyes and rotting hands clawing toward them. He felt a cold, heavy acceptance settle over him. They were out of options, out of time. "Then we go down fighting," he said, his voice steady, defiant. He pulled his sidearm, each shot methodical, each one finding its mark, but the horde just kept coming, an unstoppable tide of death. Haynes let out a strangled yell as he was pulled down, the undead swarming over him, tearing into him with frenzied hunger. His screams echoed off the alley walls, mingling with the guttural moans of the undead, a horrifying symphony of death. Marlowe fired until his clip was empty, the slide clicking uselessly as he backed against the wall. He looked over at Ruiz, her face streaked with blood, her eyes wild with fear. "Stay close," he said, his voice low, filled with grim determination. He grabbed a broken pipe lying nearby, his last weapon in this fight. The undead pressed closer, their faces twisted, jaws snapping, hands outstretched. Marlowe swung the pipe with everything he had, his mind a blur of rage and desperation, his only thought to protect Ruiz, to buy her just a few more seconds of life. But he knew, deep down, that it was a losing battle. Marlowe's breaths came in ragged gasps, the alley around him swarming with shadows and sickly gray hands clawing through the darkness. The pipe in his hand was slick with blood and fragments of bone, and every swing was met with a nauseating crunch, yet the undead kept coming. He and Ruiz stood back to back, the alley's brick walls pressing in on them, trapping them with the relentless horde. Ruiz's hatchet rose and fell, each swing taking down another of the relentless attackers. She was panting heavily, her strength waning, but her gaze remained steely, her movements fueled by sheer survival instinct. "Captain, how many are left?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper, as she decapitated another creature, blood spraying across her face. "Too many," Marlowe replied grimly, shoving a corpse back with the pipe, feeling it give way under the pressure. He stole a quick glance around them. The alleyway was quickly becoming choked with bodies, limbs sprawled, faces frozen in twisted, grotesque expressions of hunger. The few small windows lining the walls were too high and barred, and there was no way up, not that it mattered with the horde pressing in from both sides. The radio on his belt crackled with static, and for a brief moment, hope flickered in his chest. But it was short-lived. There was no voice, no backup, only the cold hiss of dead air. The feeling of isolation wrapped around him like a shroud, and he understood that any help was far beyond reach. This was it. He and Ruiz were alone. The dead were closing in, the scent of decay overpowering. Their fingers scraped against the bricks, leaving bloody smears as they pushed closer, their faces hollow and hungry. Marlowe felt a strange calm wash over him, a cold clarity that sharpened his senses. There was no way out of this, not for both of them. He glanced over his shoulder at Ruiz. She was barely holding on, her eyes darting between the advancing undead and him, as if waiting for a command that would change the impossible odds before them. "Ruiz," he said, his voice low but steady, "you need to get out of here." She blinked, momentarily stunned by the words, before the reality of their situation sank in. Captain, we're both. There's no way. Listen to me, he growled, catching her gaze. They haven't completely boxed us in. If you break through that last line, you can make it. Head back to the station. Find Ethan. Maybe he made it, maybe he didn't. But you find that kid if you can. You hear me? Ruiz's face twisted with desperation, but she nodded, her jaw clenched. She gripped the hatchet tighter, her resolve hardening as she prepared herself. I'll come back for you, Captain. I swear. Marlowe allowed himself a small, sad smile. He knew she wouldn't be coming back, and deep down, he suspected she did too. But he gave her a final nod, a wordless promise that he'd hold the line as long as he could. With a fierce battle cry, Ruiz lunged forward, her hatchet swinging in wide arcs, cutting down the undead, blocking her escape. Marlowe followed, taking down the creatures nearest to her, using his body as a shield to give her a chance to push through. She hacked her way down the alley, disappearing into the shadows as the zombies turned their attention back to Marlowe. He backed into the far wall, gripping the pipe with both hands, readying himself for the onslaught. The dead flooded toward him, their lifeless eyes fixed on the lone figure, standing defiantly against the brick. His mind emptied, his vision narrowing until all he saw were their faces, grotesque, slack, and hollow, each one an accusation of the nightmare he'd been helpless to stop. The first of the horde lunged, and Marlowe swung the pipe with a force that splintered bone, sending the creature sprawling. Another took its place, jaws snapping, hands clawing. He slammed the pipe into its temple, feeling the sickening crunch reverberate up his arm as it crumpled. But for each one he took down, another filled the gap, a ceaseless tide of bodies pressing closer, hemming him in. Sweat mixed with blood as his muscles screamed in protest, each swing slower, each breath harder to catch. The alley reeked of decay, a choking miasma that stung his eyes and burned his lungs, but he kept fighting, his determination defying the odds stacked against him. The pipe slipped from his fingers, slick with gore, and he staggered, reaching for his sidearm with a shaking hand. He fired, the shots precise, each one finding a target, but his ammo was running low, and he knew he had only seconds left. The last bullet chambered with a grim click, and he raised the gun, pressing it to the forehead of an advancing corpse, pulling the trigger in one final act of defiance. The zombie collapsed, but the others kept coming, their hands clawing, teeth snapping. Marlowe's back hit the wall, his body exhausted, his movements slowing as the undead closed in. He could feel their icy fingers gripping his arms, their teeth grazing his skin, but he kept fighting, kept resisting, refusing to go quietly. As they overwhelmed him, Marlowe's last thought was of Ruiz, her determined face as she pushed her way free. Run, kid. Run as far as you can. The dead swallowed him, their bodies piling up, and the alley fell silent, save for the sound of the undead feasting.